We have dedicated part of our program to Ghana Month. And for the next 15 minutes, we're going to tell you a story about the history of our country. We're going to do an oral narration recorded earlier, actually. It's about the constitutions of Ghana. So we're going to tell you the story from 1844 up to 1925 in the first part. It's 15 minutes long. Here is our Ghana Month oral rendition for the next 15 minutes. Enjoy. Welcome to this edition of Ghana Month, and all of this month you know that we are doing that. Tonight we want to give you an oral presentation with the spirit of independence that we are coming from over the last weekend. Tonight we'll give you an oral presentation of Ghana Month, and we are focusing tonight on the various constitutions that have occurred in the Ghana Month and the story around each of these constitutions. For our purposes, we would like to first define what the Gold Coast meant. And the Gold Coast, as we have been told, was the former name of Ghana. But that's not quite true, because the Gold Coast was in reference to the coastal area, the area from the Cape Coast, Nzima, if you like, from the Nzima area to Cape Coast to Accra to the Volta region. That was the coast. So the entire, what is today Ghana, in documentations was called the Gold Coast and the Ashanti and Northern Protectorate. That's how it was called. That's how it was called on paper. So we are now going to talk about the constitutions that have occurred in the Gold Coast leading up to 1992, if we can get there, and tell you a bit about the stories around these constitutions. So let's begin with what we think, or we would like to say, is the first documentation of a relationship between two peoples, the governed, if you like, and the government. It was the Bond of 1844. The Bond of 1844 was a relationship that was developed between the chiefs in the Fanti area, the then part of the Gold Coast, and the British business people who came in to look for business. That's as simple as that. Now, the British were offering these Fanti chiefs protection. Protection from whom? They were offering them protection from the warriors in the Ashanti and Northern territories. In those days, as we have heard, there was war everywhere. Everyone was fighting, and everyone was fighting for land. They were fighting for territory. They were fighting for minerals. So because the minerals were in the land. So if you seize a portion of land, you begin to dig for minerals. And so gold has been mined all the way since those days. Diamond has been sought after all the time since those days. So in the Bond of 1844, the British were offering the Fanti chiefs protection against all of these influences from Ashanti, from the north, in terms of war and in terms of consuming them away from their land. And in return, the British wanted to occupy their land with them and help them begin to develop. Now, in the Bond of 1844, very interesting, the British wanted some traditional and cultural practices to be desisted. Now, one of them was ritual murder, and it's in the document of the Bond of 1844. Ritual murder was to be forbidden. So that suggests that perhaps there was ritual murder going on quite regularly in the Fanti land. The Bond of 1844 said it was to be forbidden. The other thing was paneering was to be forbidden, and a few other things that they wanted the chiefs to lead their people to forbid. So they signed the Bond of 1844. It was signed among some Fanti chiefs and the British. That was 1844. That was the first time that there was interaction. So as far as the Fanti area was concerned, the interaction continued between the British and the Fanti chiefs. The British must have gone back to the Crown in England to report to them that we have found some people, they have allowed us to occupy their territory. It looks like they have a very good land. We suspect that it is out of these interactions that the name Gold Coast emerged, because they must have asked them that, how would you call them? What do they have? And they must have identified the gold in those days. And so the name Gold Coast was not identified because of gold in the hinterland. It was not identified because of gold in Ashanti or Eastern region or Boise and places like that. No, it was about the gold in the coast. There was a lot of gold. Now, recently we saw there was a lot of gold in Elmina. So it was the gold at the coast that raised the issue of entitling that parcel of land, that territory, the Gold Coast. And we suspect that it came out of the interactions of the Bond of 1844. So then came 1897, the next most important related epochal occurrence related to the Constitution of 1844, which we say is the bond. But for our purposes tonight, because we are running through constitutions, it was the Constitution of 1844. The British Crown proposed a law to take over all the lands of the Gold Coast. Not the Ashanti territory, not the Northern Territory. Those were not part of the conversations at the time. We take the land of the Gold Coast, and then we know the famous story that John Mensah Saba, the great Fanti lawyer, he traveled all the way to London and then presented a case into British High Court and fought against the acquisition of land. The British believed in those days that land that was unoccupied, and there was a lot of unoccupied land. Even today, if you are traveling from Accra to Kumasi, Accra to Cape Coast, Accra to Winneba, Winneba to Cape Coast, Mankasim to Cape Coast, you will find significant land that appears unoccupied. So the British in those days, you can imagine, 1897, there was so much unoccupied land in Accra, in Winneba, in areas around Accra. Tema was completely unoccupied. Everything in Tema was not there. So the British said that all those unoccupied lands that are not owned by anyone, so they call it ownerless land, all of those lands, let us put it together and vest it in the crown. Let the British be the owner of lands that you don't occupy or lands that you don't own. Because they assume that if you are from Accra and you live in Accra, Gamashi area, the land at Hacho, which is very far from you, is unoccupied. You don't own it. So let the British Crown own it. Now that's the kind of problem that we know has occurred in many parts of Africa. So it was John Mensah Saba who saved the day. John Mensah Saba traveled to England and argued in the court that as far as the Gold Coast is concerned, there is no unoccupied land. There is no ownerless land. Every land that you see is owned and occupied by three categories of people. The three categories are the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. That was a forceful argument that as far as Gold Coast culture is concerned, Saba successfully argued that the land is owned by the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. So the British judge said, you're right, it's okay. The British Crown cannot have the lands in the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast was significantly excluded from this wide-ranging bill that was turned into law that captured significant land across Africa, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia. This same law was passed. It was called the Land Bill. It was passed across all the British territories, and the British, by that bill, captured so much land. Because of the work of John Mensah Saba, West Africa was excluded, especially Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Britain, and Ghana, the Gold Coast, the British territories. John Mensah Saba's argument stood tall. That is why John Mensah Saba is one of the critical heroes of this republic. He was the one who saved us from the troubles of land that we see in Johannesburg, we see in Pretoria, we see in Harare, Zimbabwe, we see in Lusaka in Zambia, we see in Maputo in Mozambique. John Mensah Saba raised sophisticated, logical, rational, intellectual arguments before the British, and the Gold Coast lands were saved. That was 1897. And then came after that, the British, beginning to take the Gold Coast very seriously, now decided to come in and not just to manage the coast according to the bond of 1844, but to manage the entire territory. Because in 1900, a great war was fought. The British fought the war against the insurgents, based, or if you like, pursuant to the bond of 1844. The British began to protect the Fanti land, protect the Fantis against the insurgents who were coming from Ashanti territory and the Northern territories. And in 1900, the British decided that their main foes in this quest were the Ashanti people. So they launched a significant war in 1900 against the Ashantis. You know of the Yasantoa War, you know of all of those wars were launched in 1900. And many of the Ashanti chiefs were captured and they were sent to the Seychelles and they were exiled over there. The Najima Prempeh and others were exiled over there. It was the British efforts to quieten the Ashanti invasion of the southern part of Ghana, which is the Gold Coast. The Ashanti invasion of the Gold Coast was to be held back by the British forces. That's why 1900 was a year of war around the Gold Coast and around the territories of Ashanti and the northern areas. So that was 1900. So after all that settled down, 16 years later after that, the British decided now to have a formal relationship with the Gold Coast as a government ruled from Westminster by the British government through the Governor-General to Gold Coast first and to the territories of Ashanti and the North. This decision was taken very firmly after 1900. And so in 1916, a first constitution was promulgated. It was called the Clifford Constitution. Now in those days, constitutions were named after people. And that's very significant when we come to 1950 and 1951, because there's concern about the name of the 1950 and 1951 Constitution, because people wrote about it. So the Clifford Constitution was the 1916 Constitution. It was called the Clifford Constitution. The governor in charge was Governor Clifford. And that constitution was drawn up to create, for the first time, an executive council, like the president of Ghana that we know today. To create a legislative council, like the parliament. And also to establish that as far as judiciary was concerned, rules of Britain will operate here. And judges of Britain will operate here. And lawyers who appear before British courts were able to appear before courts in the Gold Coast with the same procedures as operated in Britain. 1916 Clifford Constitution. And then came, after that, the 1925 Governor Gudgesberg Constitution. And that's a very important one, because you've heard politicians in Ghana today talk about the Gudgesberg economy. The argument they make is that since the developmental constitution of Governor Gudgesberg in 1925, we have really not changed the way in which our economy works. Now, Clifford Constitution was a political one. 1960 was very political. It was to establish institutions of the Gold Coast, the Legislative Council, the Executive Council, and the Judiciary. Governor Clifford led the Executive Council. Now, how did they select the legislature? Governor Clifford appointed people to the legislature. Were there Africans in the Clifford Constitution of 1960? No, there were not. The legislature was made up of Europeans. So your government, the executive, was Clifford and his people. Your legislature was still British people. And your judiciary was British laws. Agitations began. The West African Conference of Casely Hayford and others began to write about these things. They began to argue about these things against the British. That how can we have a legislative council in which we don't have participation? And you are ruling over us and you are taking our taxes. And so the term was coined by J.B. Danko and others. They said, no taxation without representation. Because the Executive Council wrote down laws and they put taxes in place. So the Ghanaian people began to pay taxes. They were extracting taxes from the Gold Coasters. So you're a farmer and you bring your goods, you pay tax to the taxman. He's sitting in Osu, he's sitting in Labadi, he's sitting right with you. Some of them are Africans. They appoint them like that, and people were afraid of them. And they had names for them. And they were the taxman, and they're collecting your taxes. And so the intelligentsia at the time argued against the British that no taxation without representation. They were asking for representation in the Executive Council and representation in the Legislative Council. The Executive Council will be today's president and his ministers. The Legislative Council will be the Parliament, the Speaker and the rest of the people in Parliament. So that's what happened in the Clifford Constitution. It designed a three-part executive it designed the government, I should say, for the Gold Coast. And they ran that, and all the agitations came in. So in 1924, the agitations got to an apogee because Casely Hayford and the West African youth were writing, and they were writing hard, and organizations began to meet because by this time, some of the Ghanaians who traveled abroad had returned. And they had gone to study, they had returned. Men like Ismond and others had returned, and they were sophisticated intelligentsia, and they began to confront the British about the way in which the Gold Coast was being managed. All of the agitations happened in 1924. So in 1925, Governor Clifford was withdrawn because he became unpopular with the intelligentsia around Accra especially, and in Cape Coast as well. Not much from Ashanti, but mainly Accra and Cape Coast. And Clifford was withdrawn and Gudgesberg came in. Gudgesberg seemed to be a very popular governor. His name is on many things. If you go to Adom-Otchere School, there's a Gudgesberg house. If you go to Kolebu Teaching Hospital, I think his statue is still there. So Gudgesberg Constitution was to respond to the agitations of the intelligentsia, was to bring real development to Ghana, and also to set up the economic structure, which was mainly at that time around a single product, cocoa. Cocoa was the most powerful weapon that the Ghanaian intelligentsia held because they had control over the farmers. So the whole developmental agenda of Gudgesberg was styled, designed, and created around the economic product cocoa. And at that time, the Gold Coast was producing 2/3 of the global cocoa needs. And cocoa was a hot cake. Chocolates were being made. Juices were being made. Scientists were discovering that cocoa can be used to do creams. Everything was being discovered about cocoa. It was being a multiple product. It had a multiplier economic effect, and the Gold Coast was producing 2/3 of global needs. So it was also a useful power to the British who controlled the Gold Coast. It therefore stands to reason that the British agreed that they needed to negotiate with the Ghanaian people and offer something. And that's precisely what the 1925 Sir Governor Gudgesberg Constitution offered the people of Ghana. So the Constitution was designed to be a developmental one in response to the agitation. Therefore, in the Legislative Assembly of 1925, Africans were included. But guess what? It was not the African intelligentsia who were fighting, it was the African chiefs. So right from there, the divide and rule tactics began. And later on, we learned that the divide and rule was a part and parcel of the British colonial policy designed by Lord Lugard, who also designed indirect rule. So the divide and rule was to try and divide the chiefs and the intelligentsia to see whether the British can extend their stay a bit longer. We think that's what it was. So 1925 brought chiefs, African chiefs, into the Legislative Assembly. So you could no longer say that you are not having representation. You couldn't say that. But because your chiefs were there. But the intelligentsia were still largely outside and they were still fighting. Maybe one or two of them were in the Legislative Assembly, but not all of them. Okay. So the Gudgesberg Constitution said, let's build a hospital. Let's build a Kolebu teaching hospital. Let's build a hospital that the Africans can go to when they are not well. Let's build a hospital that has the standards of the hospitals in England. Let's build a hospital that has global standard. So they took the land from the Ga people and they built the Kolebu teaching hospital. In 1925, Kolebu was finished around that time. And then by that time also, they built Adom-Otchere School out of the Gudgesberg Constitution. They said, let's build a school that will train the Ghanaian people so they don't need to sit on the ship and go to school in England. Let's build a school. At that time, there were already schools in Cape Coast. In Fansford, Adisardel, Wesley Girls, Holy Child were all in Cape Coast. But they wanted to build a school in Accra, the seat of government. So they took land and built Adom-Otchere School. Then they also designed on the structure of cocoa. And they said, we will buy cocoa, the raw beans, from the farmers. We will pay them and buy the cocoa from them, and then we will ship the cocoa to England and it will be processed. And we will bring back the processed chocolate to the Ghanaian people for the Ghanaian intelligentsia, the Ghanaian elite, to buy for their children. And when the children like the chocolate, when they grow up, they will also eat chocolate. And cocoa will be shipped, but we'll pay the farmers money. And in addition to money, they pay the farmers in kind. They pay the farmers with British products, manufactured products that we are not used to. Sardine, tinapa, mirror, expensive alcohol, clothing, different kinds of stuff were going to the farmers. So the farmers became the richest people in the hinterland. And that's where money became a commodity as part of the Ghanaian culture. The Ghanaian culture was gold and all the stuff in the hinterland, but money in terms of currency that was coming from Britain, the pound that you could keep and you could buy something with, you could exchange goods for. This is where it all began. It began from the promulgation of the 1925 Gudgesberg Constitution. So when a politician in Ghana today, like Akufo-Addo, says that we want to change the Gudgesberg Constitution, the Gudgesberg arrangement, that's what he means. We have held the Gudgesberg arrangement from 1925 up until 2021. The structure of our economy, designed in 1925 by Governor Gudgesberg, is by and large the same economy that we manage today. And what is it? It's designed around cocoa, main product. Till today, main product, cocoa. What do we do with cocoa? We take it. The farmers are paid by Cocoa Marketing Board. The cocoa is carried, put on a ship in Tema, shipped abroad. The chocolate comes back to us. Today, we are the world's second largest producer of cocoa. Are we the first? We used to be the first for a long time. We went to third. Today, we are the second largest producer of cocoa. We no longer produce 2/3. But Ghana's economy, the major product, the whole economy is designed around cocoa. So the banks are doing cocoa work. They are giving farmers money. And when there's a breakdown in the cocoa industry, all the banks suffer. It happened a few years ago. The Cocoa Board is a very, very important economic institution to the government. Until recently, Cocoa Board was under the Ministry of Finance. Now it's under the Ministry of Agric. So this whole situation is coming from the Gudgesberg Constitution of 1925. We'll leave it here. When we come next time, we will continue with the Sir Alan Burns Constitution of 1946 that led to the Constitution of 1950. We are running through the constitutions of Ghana and the stories around them. This is our Ghana Man series on Good Evening Ghana. Thanks for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the narration and the oral presentation.
This day will never be forgotten, the 6th of March 1957, when the Gold Coast successfully get our independence officially. Ghana is the name. We wish to proclaim we will be jolly and merry and gay. The 6th of March independence.